I honestly thought that this book contained everything, and then it came out and people started emailing immediately saying, where's this recipe and where's that recipe? And I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't even think about that. Because we originally had a savory portion in this book, but it got too long, and so when it came to cutting, I said, well, we'll just cut the savory part because it's a baking book, so we don't need to put in the savory.
And you were wrong.
Yeah, well, well, it was good because then it led to a second book.
I was wondering, that's a really drastic U-turn, Harvard.
Yeah.
Applied mathematics and economics. How did that happen?
Well, I definitely didn't plan it. I think, when I was at Harvard studying math, I was a pretty typical, relatively clueless college kid who was just trying to figure out, what do I do next? What kind of job do I get next? I got a job as a management consultant, which I did for 2 years, right out of college, doing what all of my colleagues were doing, all of my peers at Harvard were doing. And then about 2 years in, I looked around at the people I was working with, and I loved this job. I mean, it was a great job with really interesting people. But I thought to myself, I don't want to be doing this when I grow up, So I decided to take a year off and just go into cooking, which I'd always loved to do at home. But I didn't intend it to be a long-term thing. It was meant to be kind of, nowadays kids take years off all the time. They'll take a year off and go travel, or they'll take a year off and go volunteer. So that was pretty much what I was doing, just taking a year off and going to cook. And once I got into a professional kitchen, I was hooked. I loved it. And it's funny, it's one of those situations where I kind of blinked, and then all of a sudden it was like 5 years later and I was still cooking and I hadn't planned it. So what started out as just a temporary break, maybe a little bit of a detour, ended up being something that I stuck with and really enjoyed. And I moved from job to job. There's a fair amount of moving around, as Chef would tell you as well, that is expected when you're young and you're supposed to work in a bunch of different kitchens and see different perspectives. So I did that, and then got to a point where I thought, I don't know who I want to work for anymore, and I actually don't know if I want to keep working for somebody. And so maybe I'll think about opening a bakery. I've always had the attitude, if I'm learning and if I'm having fun, I'm going to stick with it, and that's what kind of kept me going.
What is it that's so rewarding about being a chef, particularly a successful one?
For me, it's changed over the years. I think when I first started out and was a pastry chef at a restaurant or in a bakery, it was definitely for me, it was the immediate gratification of creating, these beautiful desserts or these delicious pastries, and then knowing that somebody, the next day or the next hour would be eating them and enjoying them. And so the immediacy of pastry and working in a kitchen really appealed to me. And so what I take pleasure in now is mentoring the people who work under me and trying to teach them how to be better pastry cooks and better managers and better leaders. It's not a totally creative endeavor for me. And in fact, I would say that that's one of my weaknesses, is that I am not a pastry chef that can create all of these amazing desserts on the fly without any planning. My strength, I think, is being able to create desserts and then also understanding how it fits in a broader business sense. Also, how can I make this customer happier? How can I make this staff member understand that, they need to treat, their coworkers in a certain way? And there's so much that goes into running a business that I think a lot of people don't think about when you're just enjoying a pastry. You're like, oh, these taste so great, we should, let's open a bakery. There's just so much behind the scenes stuff, with dealing with vendors and dealing with payroll and finance and human resources, just all of that sort of stuff.
Like a 14-hour, 16-hour day.
It's crazy, yeah. I mean, I think anybody will say that, when you work in food, it doesn't really stop, I know that Chef was saying that their kitchen is 24 hours, and ours isn't quite 24 hours, it's probably more like 18 hours, but there's always, somebody who's in the kitchen thinking and working And so if my place is open, even if we're not open to the public, I'm thinking about them. You know, even just before we got here, actually, 2 nights before we came here, I got a phone call. It was like midnight, that the gas for some reason had turned off at one of my locations, so they couldn't turn on the ovens, and they were trying to figure out, you know, what to do. And you know, even though it's midnight and we're not open, I have to think about in 4 hours our baker's going to come in and she's not going to be able to bake anything because we can't get the gas going. You know, so trying
Holy
to
cow! How do you
troubleshoot.
find the energy for this?
I know. You know, it's like, it's not an energy thing so much. I would say it's very much like having kids.
Do you have kids?
We don't have kids, but I know from my friends who do have kids that it's a constant thing. You're never not a parent. Exactly. A lot of people say that our pastries are not super sweet, which is something that I think comes from my background of not eating desserts growing up. I mean, I really didn't have many opportunities to eat sweets because my parents didn't offer it. We only had oranges. But if you read the recipe from start to finish, that's a big step up that you have over a lot of people who end up kind of looking at the recipe and looking at the ingredients and thinking, okay, I'm going to do this. And then midway through the recipe, they realize they don't have half the ingredients. So that leads into one of my second suggestions that I always tell people is to get what's called your mise en place together before you start. Mise en place is everything in its place in French, which means that you look at the recipe, you read it through, and then you take all of the ingredients and you actually measure them out and put them in like little cups or little bowls in front of you. And if you do that, then it really is step by step.